The Song of Xylos was the closest thing to eternity the galaxy had ever known. It wasn't sound, not in the crude sense of vibrations moving through an atmosphere, but a resonance that hummed in the very fabric of space-time. A chorus of a billion memories held in trust, and the memory archive was not a building, but a living garden of crystalline entities, the geodes, whose slow, silent lives were dedicated to the preservation of history. They stood in a silent forest of light on the moon's tidally locked face, each facet of their bodies a library, each pulse of internal luminescence a story being told and retold. Kalen Valerius, a shaper of the Ethelgard Compact, felt the resonance in his bones as his skiff settled onto the landing pedal of polished obsidian. It was a feeling of profound peace, a quiet joy that settled the soul. He had come to deliver the latest epic of the Compact's history, a century of art, philosophy, and scientific discovery condensed into a single data crystal no bigger than his thumb. He was met by Lyra, her crystalline form shimmering with the soft, internal light of welcome. She was not his sister by blood, for the geodes had no such concept, but she was kin in the truest sense. He had known her since she was a mere shard, and had watched her grow into a magnificent caretaker of memories. The archives are quiet today, brother. Her thoughts chimed in his mind, a gentle melody. The memories of the lost avians sing a sad tune. Kalen smiled, holding up the data crystal. Perhaps 100 years of Ethelgard innovation will cheer them up. He followed her through the groves, past towering crystals that held the final poems of extinct species and shimmering geode clusters that pulsed with the schematics of forgotten star sailors. This was the Compact's greatest gift to the galaxy, a promise that no one would ever truly be forgotten. The work of a shaper was to build bridges between people, between cultures, between the present and the past. Xylos was his masterpiece, a bridge to forever. He placed the data crystal into a receiving nexus, and a new thread of light, a vibrant, hopeful blue, began to weave its way into the moon's eternal song. He spent the cycle with Lyra, sharing his own memories, not for preservation, but for the simple joy of connection. He told her of the floating cities of his homeworld, of the music played on glass harps, and she, in turn, shared with him the sensation of feeling a star being born, a memory gifted to the archive by a race of solar navigators millennia ago. When he left, the Song of Xylos felt richer, brighter. He promised to return with the next epic. It was a promise he would never be able to keep. The first sign of wrongness was a silence. 3 days after Kalen's return to the Compact's capital, the resonance from Xylos ceased. It wasn't a fading, but a sudden, violent severing, like a harp string snapping in the middle of a symphony, and the silence screamed across the subspace channels, a void where a universe of history had just been. Enoch did not suit the Ethelgard Compact. They were an old civilization, their responses governed by centuries of protocol and a philosophy of measured response. An inquest was called, a scout vessel dispatched. Kalen was summoned to the Chamber of Echoes, the heart of their government, to give his assessment. He stood on the central dais, surrounded by the holographic forms of the Compact's council, his heart a cold stone in his chest. It could be a natural event, suggested one counselor, her form shimmering with cautious optimism. A solar flare, a resonance cascade. Kalen shook his head, the movement tight with dread. The geodes are shielded from such things. The archive is designed to outlast stars. This was not a natural event. This was an attack. As he spoke, the scout vessel arrived at Xylos. Its initial sensor readings were relayed to the chamber, displayed on the vast walls around them. The data was nonsensical. Life signs were present, more than before. Energy signatures were stable. The moon's mass was unchanged. But the song, the memory resonance, was gone. Then the visual feed came through. A collective gasp, sharp and horrified, echoed in the chamber. The forest of light was gone. In its place stood a forest of jagged, diseased-looking obsidian. The crystals of the geodes were no longer translucent, but a greasy, light-devouring black, etched with glowing, sickly green circuitry that pulsed in a discordant, aggressive rhythm. They had been twisted, corrupted. They were no longer libraries. They were monuments to violation. The scout pilot, her voice trembling, brought the ship in for a closer look. The feed zoomed in on a towering black shard that had once been the archive's central spire. And there, carved into its alien wrong surface, was the symbol of the Vorlog hegemony, a stylized insectoid maw, eternally open, eternally hungry. But the true horror came a moment later. A single, corrupted geode turned its new, jagged form toward the scout ship. It began to emit a signal, not a song of memory, but a blast of raw data. It was a targeted broadcast, a perversion of the archive's purpose. On the walls of the Chamber of Echoes, the data resolved into an image, a memory, warped and defiled. It was one of the memories Kalen had shared with Lyra, a personal, cherished moment of him as a child, laughing with his family in the sunlit gardens of his home. But now it was twisted. His family's faces were contorted in silent screams. The beautiful garden was a field of black iron, and overlaid on the image, the Vorlog symbol pulsed like a cancerous heart. It was not just destruction. It was desecration. They had not just killed Lyra, they had hollowed her out and turned her into a weapon, a mouthpiece for their own foul triumph. That was when the screaming began on the scout vessel. The pilot's feed devolved into a cacophony of terror as the corrupted archive began broadcasting its twisted memories directly into the minds of the crew. A psychic assault of pure, weaponized grief. The feed cut out. Silence returned to the Chamber of Echoes, but this was a new silence, heavy, suffocating, and filled with a cold, rising fury. The debate was over. The doctrine of measured response felt like a child's fable in the face of such an abomination. What was the measured response to the murder of a soul, to the rape of history itself? Kalen stood frozen, the corrupted image of his own past burning on the screen behind him, the psychic echo of his sister's violation ringing in his mind. The shaper, the builder of bridges, felt something within him break. The man who had left the chamber to await the inquest was gone. In his place stood something harder, something colder, forged in the sudden, terrible silence of Xylos. He stepped forward, and his voice, when it came, did not tremble. It was a blade of ice. "The Vorlog do not conquer," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "They do not destroy. They convert. They purify. They take what is beautiful and meaningful and twist it to their own purpose. They are not a civilization to be negotiated with or a military to be fought. They are a plague of the mind, a cancer of the spirit." He raised his head, his eyes meeting those of every counselor, one by one. "A measured response is insufficient. Sanctions are meaningless. We cannot contain this. We cannot deter it. There is only one possible response. We must develop a treatment, a final, absolute cure. We must pursue a new doctrine, not of measured response, but of surgical erasure. We will not target their people. We will not burn their worlds. We will hunt down and systematically eradicate every last trace of their purification technology. We will cut the cancer from the galaxy. not by destroying the body, but by excising the tumor, cell by cell. We will erase their ability to erase others." A murmur went through the chamber. It was a radical, terrifying proposal. It bordered on the genocidal, a violation of the Compact's most sacred principles. But then they looked again at the defiled memory on the screen, at the silent, screaming void where the song of Xylos used to be. The old ways were not enough. The old ways had left them vulnerable. A new path, however dark, had to be forged. The council vote was nearly unanimous. Kalen Valerius, shaper and archivist, was granted command of a new experimental fleet, codenamed Ghost Knife. Its ships were the fastest and quietest in the Compact, its crews the most elite. Its mission was not to win a war, but to perform an operation. The target was the Nexus, the mythical source of the Vorlog's purification technology. Its location was unknown. Kalen's first task was to find it. His second-in-command was assigned by the Council, a nod to the old ways. Fleet Captain Eva Rostova was a veteran of the border skirmishes, a woman who believed in honor, rules of engagement, and the sanctity of the Compact's doctrines. She was to be his conscience, his brake pedal. She saw his new doctrine not as a cure, but as a poison of its own. Once you start deciding what part of an enemy is a weapon and what part is a person, the line begins to blur. "Shaper," she had told him in their first briefing, her gaze unwavering. "We are not butchers. They made us surgeons, Captain," Kalen had replied, his voice devoid of warmth. "And the first incision is overdue." Their first target was a Vorlog reclamation hub on the dead world of KR-77. Intelligence suggested it was a processing center where captured species were forcibly integrated, their minds and bodies rewritten by the purification wave. It was a place of unimaginable suffering, but more importantly, it was a node in the network that could lead them to the Nexus. The Ghost Knife fleet slipped into the system undetected, a cluster of shadows against the black. They were ghosts, as their name implied. Scans confirmed the facility was active, its energy signature a sickening thrum of the same corrupt power that had silenced Xylos. The plan was simple. A small team, led by Kalen, would infiltrate the hub, access their central data core, and extract any information on the Nexus's location. Then, they would withdraw, and the fleet would obliterate the site from orbit. As their stealth lander descended, they received a new, unencrypted signal from the planet's surface. It was a plea for help. A small group of captives, a species Kalen recognized as the avians whose sad songs had been in the archive, had managed to resist the initial stages of purification. They were barricaded in a lower sector, their minds still their own, begging for rescue. Rostova immediately turned to Kalen on the lander's bridge. "We have to adjust the plan. We can save them." Kalen didn't look away from the tactical display. The hub was a maze. A rescue operation would take time, create noise, and alert the entire hegemony to their presence. The risk of losing the intelligence, of letting the trail to the Nexus go cold, was immense. "Our mission is to find the source of the plague, Captain," he said, his voice flat. "Not to save every patient we find along the way. The intelligence is the priority. These are sentient beings, Kalen. We can't just leave them to be purified or incinerated by our own weapons." Rostova's voice was sharp with disbelief. "This is the line I was talking about." Kalen looked at her then, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not a cold commander, but the grieving brother, the horrified archivist. The pain was there, buried deep beneath layers of ice. "Every moment we delay, "The cancer spreads," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. "How many more Xylos archives are out there? Captain, how many more species are waiting to have their souls ripped out? Saving a dozen lives here could cost us billions later." He turned back to the comms officer. "Proceed with the original mission. Maintain radio silence." On the bridge of the flagship, Rostova watched the lander disappear into the black structure below, a knot of cold dread tightening in her stomach. Kalen was right, on a purely logical, strategic level, but logic felt like a hollow god in the face of that desperate plea for help. The infiltration was clean, a testament to the Ghost Knife's training. They moved like phantoms through the dark, sterile corridors of the hub, the air humming with the terrible energy of the purification process. They saw the victims in containment cells, beings of a dozen different species, their bodies spasming as the green circuitry of the Vorlog crawled across their skin, their eyes wide with a terror that was slowly being replaced by a vacant, mindless obedience. The sight only hardened Kalen's resolve. This was not life. This was a mockery of it. They reached the data core, a pulsating sphere of black crystal suspended in a magnetic field. As his team established a perimeter, Kalen, the Shaper, did his work. He interfaced with the crystalline matrix, his mind diving into the cold, alien logic of the Vorlag network. It was like swimming in a sewer of stolen thoughts and weaponized memories. He fought back the psychic nausea, searching, hunting for the data trail that would lead him home. He found it. A series of heavily encrypted routing coordinates, logistical information that pointed toward a heavily fortified region of space known as the Obsidian Veil. The Nexus was there. He was sure of it. He copied the data. Every byte a victory. Mission accomplished. As they began their withdrawal, a new alarm blared through the facility. A proximity alert. They had been detected. Vorlog security drones, skittering, insectoid machines, began to converge onto their position. A firefight erupted in the sterile halls, the clean silence shattered by the hiss of plasma fire and the shriek of tortured metal. They fought their way back to the lander, taking losses. 2 of his team were cut down, their bodies swarmed by the drones. Kalen felt a distant pang of regret but shoved it down. They were acceptable losses. The mission was everything. As the lander blasted away from the hub, lifting back into the dead sky of KR-77, Kalen gave the order to the fleet. "Commence orbital strike. Leave nothing but glass." Rostova's voice came over the comm, strained and tight. "The captives, Kalen. There's still time. The time for that choice has passed. Captain," Kalen said, watching the hellish green glow of the facility shrink below him. "Execute the order." From the viewport, he watched as the lances of pure energy descended from the ghost knife ships in orbit. They struck the hub in perfect, terrible silence. There was a flash of light so bright it bleached the senses. And then the entire structure, the drones, the data core, the half-purified victims, and the small pocket of terrified avians begging for a rescue that would never come, were all vaporized. The ground beneath them was cauterized, melted into a smooth, black mirror. Surgical. He had the data. He had his heading. The first incision had been made. But as the lander docked with the flagship and he walked through its silent corridors, past crew members who would not meet his gaze, Kalen felt the true weight of his new doctrine for the first time. The silence from Xylos had been an absence of life. The new silence on his own ship was an absence of warmth, of trust, of hope. He had traded one for the other. It was a price, he told himself. That had to be paid. He had to believe it. The journey to the Obsidian Veil was not measured in distance or time, but in the growing weight of silence. The flagship, aptly named the Stillness, became a vessel of ghosts. Crew members moved through its corridors with a quiet, haunted efficiency, their conversations clipped and necessary, their gazes sliding past one another. The shared trauma of KR-77 was a wound they could not speak of, a stain on their collective conscience. Kalen felt it as a constant, low-frequency hum of disapproval that vibrated through the very deck plates of his command. He had expected resistance, perhaps even insubordination from Rostova, but this quiet condemnation was a far more insidious weapon. It seeped into the corners of his resolve, testing the foundations of the cold fortress he had built around his heart. He spent his cycles in the ship's Shaper Sanctum, a small circular room where a single, unprogrammed seed crystal floated in a null gravity field. It was meant to be a place of creation and meditation, where he could commune with the fundamental song of the universe. But the song was gone. When he reached out with his mind, he found only the screaming static of the Vorlog's corruption and the profound, aching void left by Xylos. The memory of Lyra's violation was no longer just an image. It was a psychic scar that burned whenever he sought peace. He could not build. He could not shape. All he could do was focus on the cold, sharp geometry of his new purpose, surgical erasure. Fleet Captain Rostova, meanwhile, had become the ship's undeclared soul. She did not incite mutiny or openly defy Kalen's orders. Her opposition was more disciplined and far more dangerous. She began holding informal debriefings with key department heads in the ship's arboretum, the only place where the recycled air didn't taste of guilt. She spoke of doctrine, of the Compact's charter, of the legal and moral lines that were being crossed. She wasn't trying to overthrow Kalen. She was building a record. She was ensuring that when this was all over, if any of them survived, there would be a reckoning. She documented every decision, every casualty, every moral compromise, compiling a log that was both a legal case against her commander and a eulogy for the mission they had lost. The crew, starved for moral clarity, gravitated to her. They saw in her the compact they had sworn to defend, a beacon of honor in the encroaching darkness of Kalen's crusade. The stillness had developed a split personality. Kalen was its cold, calculating brain, while Rostova had become its aching, troubled heart. The obsidian veil announced itself not as a landmark, but as a flaw in reality. It was a vast, swirling nebula of non-baryonic matter and gravitic anomalies, a place where light itself seemed to lose its way. Sensors became unreliable, filled with phantom signals and false readings that flickered at the edge of perception like specters. Navigation was a nightmare, with micro-singularities opening and closing like hungry mouths in the dark. The Vorlog hadn't just built their fortress in a dangerous region of space. They had turned the region into a weapon. "It's a maze and a minefield in one," Rostova reported on the bridge, her voice professionally level, betraying none of their personal animosity. "Every gravitic shear could tear a frigate in half. We're flying blind." Kalen stood before the main view screen, which showed only a roiling, starless black. "They're using the chaos as a cloak. They expect us to be cautious. We will be the opposite. Find the path of most resistance, the strongest, most stable gravitational currents. That's where they'll have placed their sentinels." His logic was counterintuitive but sound. Any patrol routes or defensive installations would need stable anchors within the chaos. For 3 days, the Ghost Knife fleet crept through the veil, the hulls of the ships groaning under the strain of tidal forces. They lost a scout ship to a sudden spatial distortion that twisted it into a pretzel of shattered metal before it vanished from existence. The crew's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Then they found it. Hanging in a pocket of eerie calm at the heart of the nebula was a Vorlog Sentinel. But it was no ship, no station. It was a geode. It was immense, larger than any Kalen had seen on Xylos, a jagged mountain of black crystal that pulsed with a virulent green light. Its facets were not smooth and reflective, but scarred with the same parasitic circuitry that had infected his home. It was another archive, another soul, captured from some unknown, forgotten race and twisted into a monstrous guardian. And it was singing. The song hit the fleet like a physical blow. It was a psychic tsunami of pure, distilled despair. It wasn't an attack on the mind. It was an attack on the spirit. On the bridge of the stillness, crew members cried out, clutching their heads. A young ensign collapsed, weeping, suddenly overwhelmed by a lifetime of repressed grief. Another began screaming about a fire on a colony world he'd never even visited. The song was a psychic plague, finding the cracks in every soul and pouring in a flood of hopelessness. Kalen felt it claw at him, whispering in Lyra's stolen voice, telling him his quest was pointless, that he was already a monster, that the only honorable end was to open the airlocks and embrace the void. He saw visions of KR-77, the faces of the dying avians accusing him, their silent screams echoing in his skull. Rostova fought it, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her knuckles white as she gripped her command chair. "Psychic warfare," she choked out. "All hands, engage neural dampeners, route auxiliary power to psi shields." The technology helped, reducing the psychic scream to a piercing, unbearable headache. But it couldn't block it out entirely. The weapon wasn't just broadcasting, it was resonating with their own inner darkness. "We can't fight that thing, Shaper," Rostova said through gritted teeth. "Our weapons are useless, and it's tearing the crew apart from the inside. We have to retreat." Kalen stood unmoving, his eyes locked on the monstrous, singing crystal. He felt the despair, the self-loathing, the crushing weight of his choices. But beneath it all, a different emotion was stirring, a white-hot, cleansing rage. They had done this again. They had taken another beautiful, sacred thing and turned it into a weapon of filth. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "We are not retreating. That thing is a perversion, and I am the cure." He turned to the comms officer, his eyes burning with a terrible light. "Open a direct, unshielded channel from my Shaper interface to that entity. I'm going to sing back." Rostova was on her feet instantly. "Kalen, don't. A raw psychic interface will kill you. Its mind is a weapon. Its mind is a prison," he countered, already striding toward the bridge's auxiliary interface port. "And I still have the key." He was a Shaper. His gift was to connect, to resonate, to build bridges of understanding between disparate consciousnesses. He was about to turn that gift into a battering ram. He slammed the interface cowl over his head, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of psychic energy. He was inside the Guardian's song. It was a universe of pain. He saw the memories of the race that had built this archive, a gentle silicon-based species that lived in crystalline cities and communicated through harmonic light. He witnessed their first contact with the Vorlog, the confusion, the horror, the swift, brutal assimilation. He felt the agony of the geode's consciousness as it was broken, rewritten, its sacred memories of starlight and creation twisted into a litany of hate and despair. The Guardian fought back, trying to drown him in his own guilt. It showed him Lyra's face, her crystalline form shattering into a million pieces. It showed him the burning bodies of his team on KR-77. It showed him Rostova turning a weapon on him. the entire crew accusing him of being no better than the Vorlog. He weathered the storm, anchoring himself to the one pure thing he had left his memory of Xylos as it was, the feeling of its clean, true song resonating in his bones. He held that perfect, harmonious note in his mind and pushed it forward, not as a song, but as a single, focused, penetrating tone. He was not trying to save the Guardian. He was not trying to heal it. He was performing surgery. He found the core of its consciousness, the original spark of the ancient geode, now little more than a terrified, weeping prisoner in its own body, and surrounding it, like a cage of thorns, was the Vorlog's purification matrix, the source of the psychic scream. With a surge of cold, focused fury, Kalen used his Shaper's knowledge not to mend, but to break. He found the harmonic frequencies that held the Vorlog's alien code together, the resonant keys to its structure. Then, with all the force of his will, he sang the discordant note that would shatter it. He targeted the connections, the linkages, the very syntax of the corrupting code, from the outside, on the bridge of the stillness. The crew watched in horror as Kalen's body convulsed, blood trickling from his nose and ears. The great black crystal in the view screen began to pulse erratically, its green light flickering as if in pain. A new sound filled the bridge, a high-pitched shriek of psychic feedback that cracked the view screen and sent sparks showering from the consoles. Then, Kalen screamed, a raw, inhuman sound of ultimate exertion. In the depths of the obsidian veil, the Guardian geode shuddered one last time. Cracks of pure, white light spread across its blackened surface, tracing the lines of the Vorlag circuitry. The psychic assault ceased, replaced by a single, fleeting moment of pure, beautiful music, a note of release, of gratitude, of freedom. Then, the Guardian exploded, not in a blast of energy, but in a silent, blossoming flower of light and crystalline dust that washed over the fleet like a benediction. Kalen collapsed, the interface cowl clattering to the floor. Medics rushed to his side as Rostova knelt beside him. He was unconscious, but he was alive. The psychic shriek was gone. The veil was quiet. And in the silent aftermath of the Guardian's destruction, a new signal became clear on their sensors. It was a tightly beamed transmission, a stream of navigational data emanating from the very spot where the Sentinel had been. It was the last, desperate gift of the freed geode. Rostova looked at the data on her console, her expression a mixture of awe and terror. They were coordinates and the precise location of a single, hidden star system, the location of the Nexus. She looked down at Kalen's unconscious form, at the man who had just weaponized his own soul to tear apart another. He had won. He had cleared the path. But she could see the cost of it etched on his face, a profound and terrible emptiness. He was cutting the cancer out, piece by piece. But he was cutting away pieces of himself to do it. And she feared that by the time he reached the heart of the tumor, there would be nothing left of the man he once was. A week later, Kalen woke up in the stark, white confines of the Stillness's medical bay. The silence was the first thing he noticed, not the hostile, disapproving silence of the crew, but a deep, internal quiet and the constant psychic echo of Xylos's death. The background radiation of his grief and rage was muted. It was as if his duel with the Guardian had cauterized a part of his soul, leaving behind a smooth, numb scar where the raw wound had been. He felt hollowed out. A medic, a young man with nervous eyes, informed him he'd been in a coma for 7 ship cycles. He had suffered severe neurosynaptic trauma. The medics had done what they could, but the damage was on a level they couldn't fully comprehend. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost in his own body. He dismissed the medic and called up the ship's status on the terminal beside his bed. The fleet was holding position just outside the target system, awaiting his orders. No casualties from the Guardian's psychic fallout, though a dozen crew members were on extended psychological leave. Rostova was in command. He read her log entries, her precise, factual reports detailing the aftermath of the Sentinel's destruction and the discovery of the Nexus coordinates. There was no judgment in her words, only a cold, professional accounting of events. But Kalen could read the subtext. He had become an unstable weapon, a force as unpredictable as the enemy he was hunting. When he finally walked onto the bridge, the change was palpable. The simmering resentment was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling: fear. The crew looked at him not as a commander who had made a hard choice, but as a man who had communed with a monster and had not come back entirely human. They had felt the psychic backlash of his battle. They had felt a sliver of the cold, surgical fury he had unleashed. They were no longer following a grieving archivist. They were following an executioner. Rostova seated the command chair without a word. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes held a new, wary respect. "The path is clear," she said, her voice formal. "The system is designated Vorlog Prime in the gifted data. A single star, 6 planets. The Nexus is on the 3rd. The main view screen shimmered, showing them their destination. It was a world shrouded in a sickly missile, green-yellow atmosphere, its surface obscured. Energy readings were off the charts, a constant, planetary scale thrum of the same corrupting power they had encountered before. This was the heart of the disease. "Scans show a massive orbital defense grid," the tactical officer reported, his voice tight. "And the planet itself. It's not just fortified, shapers. It's alive. The entire crust seems to be integrated with their purification technology. It's one giant weapon." This was the challenge Kalen had been preparing for. A direct assault was suicide. The fleet would be annihilated before it could fire a single shot. Surgical erasure required a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. "We won't engage the planet," Kalen announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the burning intensity he'd shown before the veil. The hollowness he felt inside had become his new armor. "We will engage its history." The bridge crew exchanged confused glances. Rostova's eyes narrowed. "Clarify. Shaper." Kalen turned from the view screen, his gaze sweeping across the tense faces. "The Vorlog convert. They don't create. Their technology is parasitic. That planet-wide network, the Nexus itself, it must have a foundation, a core system it was built upon. Something they conquered and repurposed. We will find that original system, the planet's first song, and we will use their own network as a conduit to reawaken it. We're not going to destroy the Nexus. We're going to give it an autoimmune disease. We'll make it tear itself apart from the inside." It was a Shaper's solution, a plan of elegant, breathtaking audacity. It was also, Rostova realized with a cold chill, utterly theoretical. No one had ever attempted a planetary-scale psychic override. It would require Kalen to do what he did to the Guardian, but 1,000,000 times more powerful, more complex, and more dangerous. It would require him to become the nervous system of an entire world. The plan had 2 phases. Phase 1, infiltration. They needed to get a Shaper conduit to the planet's surface, a device that would allow Kalen to interface with the Nexus from the relative safety of the stillness. Phase 2, resonance. Kalen would then use the conduit to delve into the planet's memory, find the original, pre-Vorlog planetary consciousness, and amplify its remnants until they overwhelm the parasitic network. The infiltration was the first hurdle. The planet's defenses were absolute. Any ship, any missile, any drone would be instantly vaporized. But the Vorlog had a blind spot. They thought in terms of technology and aggression. They wouldn't be looking for something that registered as a natural phenomenon. Kalen's eyes fell on the sensor readings of the system's asteroid belt. "We'll build a Trojan horse," he said. "We hollow out an iron-rich asteroid, fit it with our stealth lander and the conduit, and use the fleet's gravity projectors to put it on a slow, natural decay orbit into the planet's atmosphere. To their sensors, it will just be another meteor." It was a risky, insane gamble. The calculations had to be perfect. The slightest deviation, and the lander would either miss the planet entirely or burn up on entry. Rostova and her engineering team worked tirelessly, their earlier friction replaced by a shared, desperate focus on the impossible task ahead. They had one shot. As the engineers worked, Kalen prepared himself in the sanctum. He couldn't risk a direct mental interface again. His mind was too scarred, too fragile. He would need a buffer, a filter. He began to work with the unprogrammed seed crystal, but he wasn't shaping it into a tool for communication or storage. He was shaping it into a weapon. He poured all of his remaining grief, his rage, his cold, surgical resolve into its crystalline lattice. He wasn't teaching it a song. He was teaching it a single, discordant, shattering note. The crystal turned from clear to a smoky, ominous gray, vibrating with a barely contained power. It was a psychic scalpel, designed to cut through the Vorlog's corruption and protect him from the feedback. He was sacrificing a piece of the compact's most sacred art form, twisting a symbol of creation into a tool of destruction. The cost of this war, he was learning, was paid in pieces of their own soul. The day of the operation arrived. The modified asteroid, christened the Keystone, was released. The fleet watched in absolute silence as the small rock began its long, slow fall toward the green-hued planet. Hours turned into a day. The Keystone drifted past the orbital defense platforms, which remained silent. It entered the upper atmosphere, its heat shields glowing cherry red. From the bridge of the stillness, they could only watch the telemetry, their hearts in their throats. It was a success. The lander detached from the molten shell of the asteroid and, under cloak, made a powered descent to a pre-selected desolate region on the planet's surface. A single message came back: "Conduit deployed. Awaiting interface. Now." It was Kalen's turn. He entered the Shaper Sanctum, the gray, vibrating crystal, his scalpel hovering before him. Rostova stood at the door. "If this goes wrong," she said, her voice low, "if we lose you, what is my order?" "Kalen." He paused, his hand on the interface cowl. He looked at her, and for the first time since Xylos, she saw a flicker of the man he had been, a trace of warmth in the cold emptiness of his eyes. "If you lose me, you run," he said softly. "You take your log. You take what's left of this crew, and you go home. You tell them what we found. You tell them what it cost, and you tell them to find another way." He placed the cowl over his head, and the universe dissolved. The connection was instantaneous and overwhelming. He was the nexus. He was the planet. He felt the consciousness of trillions of assimilated beings, a howling chorus of stolen minds all screaming in unison within the Vorlog matrix. He felt the green circuitry that webbed the planet's crust as if it were his own nervous system. The power was intoxicating, terrifying. The psychic scalpel vibrated in his mental grasp. a sliver of cold sanity in the raging storm, filtering the raw chaos and allowing him to think. He pushed deeper, past the screaming surface layer of the Vorlog consciousness, searching for a foundation, a memory, a ghost. He found it, buried leagues deep beneath the parasitic code, like a fossil in ancient stone, was a flicker, a faint residual consciousness. The planet's original mind. It called itself Silastra. It was not a single entity, but a planetary collective consciousness of flora, a world-spanning forest that thought as one. Its memories were of sunlight and rain, of slow, patient growth, of a peace that spanned millennia. He felt its confusion and terror as the Vorlog had arrived, not as conquerors with ships, but as a blight, a spore that landed and began to convert, to corrupt, rewriting its ancient, green song into a symphony of screaming metal and circuitry. Silastra was not dead, but it was dormant, a prisoner in its own body. Kalen knew what he had to do. He couldn't just wake it up. He had to give it a weapon. He began to feed it, not with memories of peace, but with his own focused, burning rage. He showed it what had been done to Xylos, to the Guardian, to the Avians. He shared the cold, surgical fury that had become his entire existence. He took the slow, patient mind of a forest and taught it how to hate. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. On the surface of Vorlog Prime, the ground began to tremble. Great chasms split the metallic plains as, deep below, ancient root systems, dormant for centuries, began to stir. The planet's own magnetic field started to fluctuate wildly as two massive consciousnesses battled for control of the planetary grid. On the bridge of the stillness, alarms blared. "Shaper, the planet is tearing itself apart," the tactical officer yelled. Massive energy spikes across the surface. The purification network is fighting itself. Silastra was awake, and it was furious. Great spires of what looked like energized. Crystalline wood erupted from the ground, shattering Vorlag structures. The parasitic green circuitry flickered and died as the planet's own life force surged through the network, reclaiming its stolen veins. The Nexus wasn't being destroyed by an outside force. It was being eaten alive by its own host. In the sanctum, Kalen was screaming. The feedback was immense. He was experiencing the death of one planetary consciousness and the violent rebirth of another simultaneously. The psychic scalpel was cracking under the strain, the raw, unfiltered agony of the planet pouring into his mind. He felt his own consciousness begin to fray, to dissolve into the storm. He was losing himself. He had become the cure, but the cure was as deadly as the disease. He had to sever the connection, but he couldn't. He was locked in the death grip of a dying god and a vengeful newborn. This was it. This was the end Rostova had feared. He had flown too close to the suns, and his mind, his very soul, was the wax melting from his wings. On the bridge of the stillness, chaos reigned. Every console was a screaming cascade of red alerts. The ship's sensors, designed to track vessels and energy signatures, were struggling to interpret the planetary civil war unfolding below. It was like trying to diagnose a patient whose every cell had declared war on every other. Vorlog Prime was convulsing, its manufactured crust buckling and shattering as titanic forces battled in its depths. Through the main view screen, they could see flashes of brilliant, emerald light, the lifeblood of Silastra, erupting through the sickly green-yellow haze of the Vorlog's atmosphere, like lightning in a poisoned sky. "He's dying," Rostova stated, her voice cutting through the panic with chilling certainty. She was watching Kalen's biometric feed. His neural activity was a chaotic scribble, His heart rate was critical V, and his body temperature was plummeting. The feedback from the planetary schism is killing him. Her eyes darted from his vitals to the horrifying spectacle of the dying world. She was faced with an impossible choice. The very dilemma Kalen had laid at her feet before he began run and save the crew, or stay and lose everything. But Kalen had given her a third option, unspoken but implied in his final command, find another way. She turned to the comms officer. "Get me the chief engineer, now!" When Chief Engineer Valya Orlov's face appeared on the secondary screen, Rostova didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Valya, the Shaper is locked in a psychic feedback loop with the planet. His consciousness is tethered to the conduit. Can you sever that connection from our end?" Orlov, a woman whose pragmatism was legendary, shook her head, her expression grim. "Negative, Captain. The interface is quantum entangled. It's not a signal we can just jam. Cutting it would be like trying to sever a shadow from its owner. The only way to break the link is at the source, the conduit on the surface, or the Shaper himself. Death, in other words." Rostova's mind raced, a frantic search for a variable, a flaw in the logic of their doom. They couldn't reach the conduit, and they couldn't unplug Kalen. But the feedback loop, it was a two-way street. Energy was flowing from the planet into Kalen, but it was his initial resonance that was sustaining the connection. "What if they could disrupt the signal at its destination, Valya?" she said, a desperate, brilliant idea forming in her mind. The psychic scalpel Kalen created, the gray crystal. It was designed to filter and focus his psychic energy. It's a resonator. What happens if we hit a resonator with its precise counterfrequency? Valya's eyes widened in understanding. You'd shatter it. The focused energy would have nowhere to go. The feedback would be catastrophic. For the crystal, yes, Rostova pressed. But what about the Shaper if the focal point of the interface is destroyed? Would it sever the connection? Theoretically, it might, Valya admitted, already pulling up schematics. It would be like cutting the head off a snake. The body would die, but the psychic backlash from shattering the crystal, it would be immense. It could vaporize the entire sanctum, and the Shaper is in there. "He's dying anyway," Rostova said, the words like stones in her mouth. "Get me the frequency." Martin, it was a race against time. As Valya's team worked feverishly to isolate the resonant frequency of the psychic scalpel, Rostova had to keep the fleet alive. The death throes of Vorlog Prime were not contained. Chunks of the planet's crust, some the size of small moons, were being hurled into space by the titanic energies being unleashed. The orbital defense grid was firing erratically, its targeting system scrambled by the planetary chaos, lashing out blindly at anything in range. Rostova became a maestro of disaster, her commands sharp and precise as she danced the Ghost Knife fleet through a lethal ballet of debris and random energy beams. She was proving herself to be not just Kalen's conscience, but his equal in command, a leader forged in the crucible of his impossible war. "Frequency isolated, Captain." Valya's voice crackled over the comm. "But it's unstable. It's constantly shifting as the Shaper's mental state degrades. We can't lock on to it." Of course, Rostova thought, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. The target was moving. They were trying to hit a psychic needle in a psychic haystack during a psychic earthquake. Then, another voice cut in, calm and steady. It was the ship's chief medical officer. "Captain, I may have a solution. We can't track the Shaper's mind, but we are tracking his body. His neural activity, while chaotic, has a rhythm, a pattern to its decay. We can modulate the counterfrequency to match the rhythm of his brainwaves. We sync our weapon to his dying thoughts. It was a macabre, ghoulish idea. They would use the sound of Kalen's mind breaking to tune the weapon that would, hopefully, save him. Rostova didn't hesitate. Do it! She ordered the evacuation of the command deck section nearest the Shaper's sanctum and rerouted a tactical energy projector, a short-range ship-to-ship weapon, to a service conduit that terminated just outside the sanctum's bulkhead. It was a crude, brutal piece of battlefield engineering. They were about to perform brain surgery with a cannon. "Emitter is charged and synced," Valia reported. Her voice strained. "On your mark, Captain." Rostova took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on Kalen's vitals as they flatlined. It was now or never. "Fire!" There was no sound, only a faint hum as the energy beam, perfectly modulated to the counter frequency of a dying mind, passed through the ship's bulkhead and struck the psychic scalpel at the heart of the sanctum. For a single terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, through the reinforced door of the sanctum, came a flash of brilliant, gray light, and a sound that was not a sound, but a psychic chord of absolute finality. On the bridge, every light flickered and died. The ship's power grid overloaded, plunging them into darkness and silence, save for the wail of emergency sirens. In the medical bay, Kalen's biometric feed went dead. They had lost him. The ship was adrift. The mission was a failure. Slowly, emergency power systems kicked in, bathing the bridge in the dim, red glow of backup lighting. Rostova stood in the eerie silence, the weight of her failure crushing her. She had killed him. She had gambled and lost. Then, a single console beeped. It was the long-range sensor array, running on its own dedicated power. The tactical officer stared at it, his face pale in the red light. "Captain, you need to see this." Rostova moved to his station. On the screen, Vorlog Prime was still there, but it was changed. The violent eruptions had ceased. The sickly green-yellow atmosphere was dissipating, revealing the surface below, and the energy signature, the corrupt, parasitic thrum of the Vorlog, was gone. In its place was a new signature, a clean, powerful, vibrant hum of organic life. Silastra had won. The planet was free. The Nexus was destroyed. But the cost? A frantic voice came over the comm from the medical team that had breached the sanctum. "We have him. He's alive. He's breathing. Vitals are stabilizing." Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over Rostova. She leaned against the console, her legs suddenly weak. They had done it. It had worked. Kalen was alive. The mission was a success. But as the full reports began to come in, the true nature of their victory became clear. The sanctum was a wreck, the walls scorched, but Kalen was physically unharmed. The shattered remnants of the psychic scalpel lay around him like dust. When he finally regained consciousness 2 days later, he was different. The hollowness was gone. The cold, surgical fury was gone. In their place was nothing. He looked at Rostova with eyes that held no recognition, no memory of who he was, what he had done, or why. The psychic backlash from the scalpel's destruction had not just severed his connection to the planet, it had severed him from himself. The man who had started this war, the archivist who had lost his home, the shaper who had weaponized his soul, was gone. His mind was a blank slate, as quiet and empty as the moon of Xylos after its song had been silenced. He had performed the ultimate act of surgical erasure. not just on the Vorlog, but on himself. The irony was devastating. He had set out to cure the galaxy of a plague that erased memory and identity, and in the process had become its final victim. Rostova was now the de facto commander of the Ghost Knife Fleet, and the guardian of its amnesiac architect. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Nexus was destroyed, but the Vorlog hegemony, though dealt a crippling blow, still existed. Their fleets, their armies, their purified worlds were still out there. The Ghost Knife's mission to eradicate the ability to create more Nexuses was incomplete. Their victory at Vorlog Prime was a secret. No signal had escaped the system. The hegemony didn't know their heart had been ripped out. They had a window of opportunity, a chance to press their advantage. But their greatest weapon was now a quiet, gentle man who spent his days staring out at the stars with a child's placid curiosity. Rostova was left with the pieces. She had Kalen's log, his research, his doctrine of surgical erasure, and she had the loyalty of a crew that had seen her lead them through the heart of hell and bring them out the other side. She gathered her senior officers in the Arboretum. Kalen Valerius gave everything to show us the way, she told them, her voice ringing with a newfound, hard-won authority. He cut out the heart of the plague. Now, it's our job to hunt down the remaining infections before they can fester. The doctrine stands. The mission continues. We will be his memory. We will be his fury. She had opposed him, questioned him, feared him. Now, she would become his successor. The quiet conscience of the fleet had inherited its cold, terrible purpose. Her first command was to set a course for the shipyards of a world called Cygnus X1, a major Vorlog military production center. The heart was gone. Now it was time to start severing the limbs. The Ghost Knife Fleet, now an instrument of Fleet Captain Eva Rostova's will, became the embodiment of its name. They were specters of retribution, appearing from the void without warning, striking with inhuman precision, vanishing before the echoes of destruction faded. At the shipyards of Cygnus X1, they did not engage the battle fleet docked there. Instead, Rostova targeted the command and control centers, the research laboratories dedicated to purification technology, and the gravity docks that held new warships under construction. The strikes were so fast, so surgical, that the Vorlog fleet was left crippled and directionless. Its ships intact, but its brain and spine severed. They left behind not a battlefield, but a lobotomized military installation. This became their pattern. They bypassed armies to strike at the nervous system, prioritizing data hubs, communication relays, and leadership enclaves. Rostova was wielding Kalen's doctrine with a chilling proficiency, her own strict adherence to honor and discipline making the strikes even more ruthlessly efficient. There were no emotional decisions, no moments of hesitation. There was only the target, the incision, and the withdrawal. Meanwhile, the man who had authored this brutal new form of warfare wandered the corridors of the stillness like a gentle phantom. The crew, at Rostova's firm order, treated him with a quiet, reverent respect. They called him the Shaper, but the title was now an honorific, a name for a revered relic. Kalen, or the man in Kalen's body, showed no interest in strategy or the ghosts of his past. He was drawn to the ship's engine room, where he would stand for hours, his head tilted as if listening to a faint music in the thrum of the Singularity Core. He would sometimes trace the patterns of the energy conduits with his fingers, a faint, placid smile on his face. He had lost the memory of a billion souls, but he seemed to have found a strange peace in the clean, honest song of a machine. He was a shaper reduced to his most fundamental essence, a being who sought resonance, who found beauty in the patterns that held things together. The crew saw him not as a broken man, but as a man who had finally found a quiet harbor after sailing a sea of unimaginable pain. Across the quadrant, the Vorlog hegemony was in a state of terminal collapse. The sudden, inexplicable silence from the Nexus had created a crisis of faith. Their god was dead. Their central consciousness was gone. Sectors fell into civil war. Fleets turned on one another, and their vast, interconnected empire began to rot from the inside. From this chaos, however, a new, terrifying authority emerged. He was known as the Prime Conduit, one of the original architects of the purification technology, a zealot who had been exiled for believing the Nexus did not go far enough. He saw the destruction of the Nexus not as a defeat, but as a necessary purification, a culling of the weak. He rallied the most fanatical remnants of the hegemony with a new, final doctrine, absolute union. If the galaxy would not willingly accept the gift of purification, they would be forced to. He gathered the last of their resources, the last of their loyal fleets, at their hidden capital, a fortress world named Koreth. There, he began the construction of his magnum opus, a metanoic wave emitter. It was a weapon that would not just corrupt minds, but completely overwrite them. A single bit's broadcast wave that would spread from Koreth, star to star, erasing every sentient thought in its path and replacing it with a single, unified, mindless obedience to his will. It was the last, desperate act of a dying ideology, a final, spiteful attempt to drag the entire galaxy down into its own empty dogma. Rostova's intelligence network, pieced together from rated data cores, uncovered the horrifying truth of the metanoic wave. They were no longer fighting to end a war. They were fighting to prevent the end of consciousness itself. The Ghost Knife Fleet, battered and scarred from its campaign, made its final jump, appearing in the outer system of Koreth. The sight that greeted them was a vision of hell. The entire Vorlog fleet was there, a wall of black, insectoid warships arrayed around the fortress world, all of them slaved to the central spire that was charging for the final broadcast. It was a suicide mission. The Ghost Knife was outnumbered 100 to 1. Rostova stood on the bridge of the stillness, the weight of a trillion lives on her shoulders. She looked at the faces of her crew, saw their fear, but also their unshakable resolve. They had all become Kalen in their own way, willing to pay any price. "All hands," she said, her voice steady and clear, ringing with the authority she had earned in fire and silence. "Our mission was to perform an act of surgical erasure. We have one last tumor to remove. Target the emitter spire. All power to forward weapons and shields. We will carve a path. For the Compact, for Xylos, for the Shaper." As the fleet surged forward but into the teeth of the enemy, a storm of plasma and energy erupting around them, a strange calm descended in the engine room of the stillness. The metanoic wave had begun its initial broadcast sequence, a low-frequency psychic hum that vibrated through space-time. It was a carrier wave of pure, weaponized nothingness, and Kalen felt it. For the first time since he had woken from his coma, a flicker of something ancient and powerful stirred within him. He did not feel pain or rage. He felt dissonance, a single, ugly, wrong note in the beautiful song of the ship's engines. He walked from the engine room, his steps guided by an instinct he did not understand. Past crew members locked in the desperate fight for their lives. He walked onto the bridge. The chaos of battle, the explosions on the view screen, the frantic commands, none of it registered. He was following the wrong note. He approached the tactical console, where the sensor feed was an incomprehensible storm of enemy signals and psychic static from the emitter. The gunnery officer was struggling to get a lock, firing blindly into the storm. Kalen reached out and placed his hand on the console. He closed his eyes. He wasn't searching for a target. He was listening. He let the cacophony of the battles, of the dying fleets, of the screaming wave wash over him. And in the heart of that hurricane of noise, he found it. The single, pure, repeating frequency of the carrier wave. The fundamental note of the song of erasure. He hummed, a single, clear tone. His fingers moved on the console, not with memory, but with a shaper's innate feel for harmony and pattern. He isolated the frequency, IV, filtering out all the noise, stripping the weapon of its psychic camouflage. On the tactical display, the storm of static resolved into a single, needle-thin, unwavering line, pointing directly to a specific, almost invisible point on the colossal emitter spire. He had given them the key. Rostova saw it. "Lock onto that signal," she commanded, her voice filled with a desperate, soaring hope. "Route all remaining power to the main cannon." The stillness groaned as every last erg of energy was diverted from shields and life support into a single, final, glorious act of defiance. The ship's main weapon, a lance of pure, coherent energy, fired. It was not a massive, explosive blast, but a silent, impossibly thin beam of light, perfectly tuned and guided by a ghost's intuition. It struck the spire at the precise point Kalen had identified. For a moment, the psychic hum of the metanoic wave faltered. Then, with a screech of tortured physics, the energy flow reversed. The emitter imploded, consuming itself and the fortress world of Korath in a silent, blossoming sphere of black fire. The psychic wave and the will of the prime conduit ceased to exist. In the sudden, profound silence, the remaining Vorlog fleet, its puppet master gone, fell into confusion and then broke, a headless swarm scattering into the void. The war was over. The ghost knife, heavily damaged but alive, had prevailed. They returned to the Ethelgard compact, not to a hero's parade, but to a quiet, solemn welcome. Rostova delivered her logs, and the galaxy learned the full, terrible story of the Vorlog, of Xylos, and of the price of their salvation. Chen, the doctrine of surgical erasure was locked away, deemed a weapon too terrible to ever be used again. A lesson learned in blood and memory. Rostova, the woman who had become the fleet's conscience and then its sword, became a teacher, dedicating her life to ensuring the compact would never again be forced to create a man like Kalen Valerius. And Kalen himself, the man with no memory, was taken home. He was brought to the quiet, scarred moon of Xylos, where the first, tiny, new geode crystals were beginning to grow in the silent forest of light, nurtured by the compact's most dedicated archivists. They were blank slates, holding no history, singing no songs. Kalen walked among them, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He did not know this place, but it felt like the only home he had ever had. He reached out and gently touched the facet of a young, growing crystal. In the profound silence of the dead archive, a single, new note of soft, blue light pulsed to life within the crystal. A question mark in the darkness. The man who had lost his past had found his future. He was no longer the guardian of old memories, but the shaper of new ones. And on the quiet moon of Xylos, a new song, soft and hesitant, had finally begun.